Today on our program, we'll take a look at the major contributions made by the Chinese who came to the American West in the 19th century to build the Transcontinental Railroad. A special exhibit at the State Railroad Museum in Carson City tells the story. But first, we'll head to the mountains just west of Reno, where a related archaeological dig is underway, made easier by a fire that roared through here a decade ago.
Welcome to Verdi, Nevada. We're at a Passport in Time program sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service, and we're at a Chinese lumbering site. That is to say, this is where the story all begins, in a sense, as we tie in lumbering, railroad, and mining. The Chinese started to work on the Central Pacific Railroad in 1865. And about 12,000 Chinese were building the Central Pacific Railroad, forming about 90% of the railroad employees for the Central Pacific. They came through this area, and Verdi was one of the stations of the Central Pacific before it got to Reno. They had to clear the land, they had to clear the road, they had to cut the trees, they had to make the ties, they had to provide the fuel for the railroad. Lumbering became an important part of the Comstock, providing all the wood products that the community needed, providing the fuel for the V&T railroad to go up and down from Carson City to Virginia City. And it is this wood that provided a lot of that fuel for the mines, for the timber in the mines, for building the communities, for building the houses, for building the wagons. All of these things began here, and we will see that when we go to the Railroad Museum, we'll see the exhibit and see how this plays into the picture. It is here that the Chinese not only helped cut the wood, stack the wood, we know that they also collected the wood, unloaded the wood at the train station so that it could be shipped elsewhere. They worked all over this area between 1869, well actually a little earlier, until about 1886. And in 1886 there was a huge anti-Chinese movement that began in Truckee, targeted against those Chinese who were working in the lumbering industry and driving them out of California and Nevada. And in Truckee they were fairly successful, for the population, which at one time in 1880 was 2,000, dropped rapidly to about 90, and by 1900 there were only 2 Chinese living in Truckee. We see the same phenomenon occurring in Carson City, for when the attack came on the lumbering, the Chinese involved in lumbering, we see that they began to leave Nevada as well. And it wasn't just the anti-Chinese movement. There were also other things going on. There was the depletion of the forests, there was the decline of the Comstock, which then meant we don't need as much wood, and we see that technology had improved to such a degree that only the big lumbering magnates could cut the wood, transport them, market them, ship them. And it is in the 1890s that we begin to, 1880s and 1890s, that we begin to get the shipping of lumber not only to the western part of the United States, but also overseas to China. And that makes a very interesting story as this transportation and trade moves back and forth across the Pacific. And behind me, what you're seeing is a combination of history and archaeology at work. This is a cooperative project with volunteers through the Forest Service and the University of Nevada, Reno, and the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So we're all in here working. We have people from all over the United States who volunteered to dig, ranging in age from 12 until retirees. And what they're doing is trying to recreate the history of the Chinese lumberman who left no written records for us to consult.
We're excavating this site to understand how Chinese in the 1880s lived on the environment in the forest harvest zones, away from large communities, how they made a living. And an important thing about this site is public participation, where we have groups of interested volunteers out here excavating the site. And the artifacts that we get will go to a museum and be analyzed by laboratory specialists, and that will help us find out what they were doing here. it's an important part of the Forest Service job, and I think for the public at large to preserve these kind of sites, because private individuals can come along and collect artifacts, but most of the time they're taken out of their original context and just put on a mantle, and people look at them and go, ooh, ah, but they don't have much meaning unless they're with other artifacts that they were originally used with. So that context is really important. Many of these artifacts are on display at local and regional museums, and in fact right now there is a display at the Railroad Museum if you'd like to go see Chinese artifacts from sites like this.
There's a photograph of my grandmother Kee at the Railroad Museum. It's with her family, and actually my father is the baby that's sitting on her lap. And the reason I'm here is because my grandmother, by the way, was born in Carson City in 1876, and her father was a woodcutter in the Carson, Tahoe area and was a labor contractor for Dwayne L. Bliss. And so this dig has some significance to my heritage, so that's why I'm here. So I think it's very exciting to be finding these Chinese artifacts, because there's not that much that I know about my great-grandfather's life. So this is helping me to learn a little more about those days, which was over 100 years ago.
So by finding these objects, we can see what they were doing. For example, we know that they were wearing Western lumbering boots, that they were probably wearing jeans, that they ate a lot of Chinese food, but they augmented that Chinese food with American foodstuffs. So we're getting a feeling for what these people were doing, how they were living, what they were doing for their work. We have found today, for example, some fragments of opium tins, and these fragments of opium didn't necessarily mean that these people were addicted to opium, but rather used small amounts when they were in pain, just as we use aspirin. And we see that it also helps suppress their sexual appetite and their food appetite. So there may be some variety of reasons for them to have used the opium with this kind of job that they were working here, which was very dangerous, cutting wood, having trees fall, having logs coming down the flumes at 90 miles per hour. You really had to be on your toes. So I don't think you're going to find opium addicts in this area, even though we have found fragments of opium tins here. It's really interesting because these sites lend things to the museum and enlivens the history not only of the people such as the Chinese who were railroad workers, but the whole history of railroads and what the people were doing, how they lived, how these roads that we take for granted came into existence and were in use, and the people who put it together. Without the Chinese railroad workers, the West could not have been opened and settled as fast as it was. And so they are an important link in the whole history of the West.
Coming up next, we'll head to the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City to take a closer look at this exhibit through the eyes of Dr. Fawn Chung.